Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are happy to host Professor Gray Nearing, who is currently a visiting faculty at Google Research in Mountain View. He is also the Director of Research of Upstream Tech, which is a public benefit corporations. He is transitioning from the University of Alabama to the University of UC Davis, where he will start shortly as a professor in the Land, Air, and Water Resources Department. After previous experience at the University of Alabama and research experience at the University of Maryland, NCAR, and the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. His research focuses on large-scale hydrological modeling for flood forecasting, agricultural monitoring, and weather and climate forecasting. He's particularly interested in model data fusion and how to use remote sensing and other type of hydrologic observations to improve hydrology models. His work relies on a lot of machine learning and data assimilation techniques. And today, his talk has the provocative title, What Role Does Hydrological Science Play in the Age of Machine Learning? And with that, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so this is the title. It is a provocative title, and I've kind of toned down the talk. So this title is the title of a talk I gave at a Google workshop back in February, and it's also the title of a opinion paper that we just had accepted in Water Resources Research. And so I'm actually not going to give the super controversial, super opinionated version of this talk here, and because now that paper is public and you can go read it, and you can kind of get my hyperbolic, let's say, provocative take on the relationship between hydrological science and machine learning in the paper. What I'm going to do today, at least for the first half hour in this public session, is talk a little bit about the experiments that we've run, the way that we've started to use machine learning in hydrological simulation and forecasting, and kind of give you a sense of where I see that going in the future. So just to be clear, I think a better title for this talk would be Deep Learning for Rainfall Runoff Modeling. But if you're interested in the more, I've certainly taken a swing at hydrological sciences in this opinion paper, and you're welcome to go see it. It's on Earth Archive and in Water Resources Research. Just to be clear, everything that I'm going to talk about today is a collaboration between a large group of people. Everything, with a few minor exceptions, is all open source on this neural hydrology GitHub repository that's owned by Frederick Kratzert, who is listed here as the second author. So Frederick Kratzert is a PhD student in Sepp Hochreiter's lab at Johannes Kepler University, and really Freddie should be the first author on this talk. So this is, I would say, Freddie is the sort of guiding light in this project, and he deserves most of the credit. I just kind of put my name first because I'm the one actually sitting here speaking. But Freddie maintains the GitHub repository, and he's done a lot of the work making sure that this is code that's usable by the whole community and kind of doing a lot of the basic research. Okay, so just to be clear, this is a small summary of a very large project that a lot of people have worked on in one way or another. Okay, so just to give a very simple background, most of what we're going to talk about today, in fact, I think I cut out all slides that don't talk about this, use long short-term memory networks. So this is one very specific type of deep learning. It's one that we like a lot for hydrology, for a reason I'll explain in just a second. But basically, the way that these work is that it's a deep learning network that with a particular set of gates and activation functions and gates arranged in a certain way to work well for time series simulation, right? So this is a recurrent neural network. This is sort of the gate structure at one time step in the recurrence pattern, and so you feed in some intervals at a particular, some data at a particular time t, spaced at some finite interval, and you get a prediction at that time step. And there's a state vector that carries information through time. So most of you probably know what an LSTM looks like. There's three major components of an LSTM, and I think it's important that we have a basic understanding of what these are because we'll need it at the end, toward the end of the talk when we talk about how we might adapt these better for hydrological and physical systems. Basically, there's three major components of an LSTM. There's this multiplication component. So again, the state vector is x. The state comes in at time t-1. It gets updated through a series of operations, and it comes out with new values. State vector at time t has new values that's fed into the gate structure at the next time step, and so on and so forth. So what happens to the state at any given time is something acts on the memory time scale. So we get a set of activation functions that multiply the state value by values between 0 and 1. And so if you multiply these states by values that are close to 0, you tend to forget what's in the past. And if you multiply them by values that are close to 1, you tend to remember what's happened in the past. So you have a set of neural networks, sigmoid activated neural networks usually, although that can change, that can directly control the memory time scale of the problem. You have what's called an input gate, which adds value to the state vector. So the value that's added to the state vector comes from a combination of the previous state at the previous time step, and the boundary conditions or the inputs at the current time step are fed through a gate structure, nonlinear gate structure. Here we're using hyperbolic tangents, which is standard. And then the value that comes out of that gate structure is added to the states. And so the states increase in value through the input state relationship, and they decrease in value through this forget gate, which controls the timescales. And then the output gate of the neural network sends information from the states to the output of whatever you're going to predict with the model. Okay, so this is worth knowing for two reasons. One we'll describe now, and again, one we'll describe much later in the presentation. But the basic reason why this is interesting for hydrological forecasting problems is because it looks like how we often conceptualize dynamical systems. Okay, so if we draw a box around some area of the world, some watershed, for example, we have fluxes across the boundary of that control volume. So we have fluxes into the control volume, fluxes out of the control volume, and we may have subdivision inside of that control volume. So like soil moisture states, or vegetation water content states, or groundwater storage states, or whatever these are. But we send fluxes into the boundary. That changes the value of the state, the storage state inside of the control volume, and we have fluxes out of the boundary, which also change value of the storage state in the control volume. So we have what's typically called an input state output relationship. And if you write this down as a system of PDEs and you solve those PDEs explicitly across like a finite element grid, you're going to get something that feels intuitively, although not formally, much like an LSTM, right? So we're going to solve that. We're going to solve that dx/dt system of equations across a discrete time step, and we're going to get something that looks like this recurrent pattern. And the time step, single time step transfer function in that PDE solution is going to look like is going to be emulated by what's happening in this gate structure at one time step of the LSTM. So there's sort of the reason that we picked that Freddie Kratzer picked LSTMs up off the shelf to use for this problem originally is because they had this sort of intuitive feeling of similarity with how hydrologists typically think about building hydrology models for catchment simulation. You can kind of view these LSTMs as sort of the time step component in deeper neural networks. So when people forecast hydrological systems, they want to do more than just give it rainfall and predict runoff. We want to predict river networks. We want to give it gridded, spatially aware input data like topography data or satellite data or precipitation data. We want to give it information about human adjustments to catchments and anthropogenic influences on catchments and climate. And we want to give it information about the geology and the vegetation and the soil structure of watersheds. We want to give all these different types of information to the model, and we want to get a lot of different types of information out of the model. So typically we want to produce hydrographs, so we could have a regression layer, a head layer at the end of our LSTM that produces hydrographs. That's sort of the level 1 type of situation. We might want to produce probability distributions, so we might have probabilistic head layers that produce probabilities instead of values of the quantities we want to predict. And we might want to predict stream flow in particular across a network structure of rivers, and so we might use something like a graph convolution as a second layer or a head layer. You might think about it as in an LSTM type model, so that the LSTM or some time series model is predicting rainfall runoff relationships at nodes, and then you're doing some sort of convolution across an irregular topography to give you something that looks like a routing function to route water from subcatchments into major reaches of channels. We might want to predict different timescales. So this is an example of something that one of my colleagues is doing at Upstream Tech. Alden Sampson is predicting seasonal forecasts from LSTMs, whereas some of the work that we're going to present here today are daily and sub-daily forecasts. And so you might have different head layers to deal with these types of situations. So this is kind of one piece in a larger family of deep learning models to deal with hydrological forecasting problems. And for the purposes of this sort of 25-minute talk, we're really going to focus on this central piece here. How are we actually doing simulating how rainfall turns on into stream flow? The experiments that we're going to use this thing called the CAMELS Dataset, which comes from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. It's probably become the de facto standard benchmark data set for hydrological modeling. The hydrology community has a problem not formally benchmarking, so we don't keep formal track of how well models do under different conditions. Everything is sort of ad hoc. There was a great paper out of NCAR very recently, last year or two, that talks about how when a particular hydrology group chooses a model to use, that choice is not based on any, usually based on evidence about which model works best under which conditions. It's usually based on legacy, so who they know or who in the group has worked with what model before. And so the NCAR team, some hydrology team was able to go out and sort of see why people choose what models they do, and it's usually not evidence-based. So one thing that's happening in the hydrology communities, we're trying to develop benchmark data sets that sort of everybody uses to understand how models compare and how they work better here or there or under what types of conditions, so that we can build better models. Okay, so we're using the CAMELS data set. We're using 531 catchments ranging in size between 4 square kilometers and 2,000 square kilometers, all in the continental United States. And we're training on 9 years of data, daily data, and we're giving it meteorological forcing data. So that's radiation, temperature, pressure, wind speed, and precipitation. And we're giving it catchment attributes, which are things that we presume don't change over the time scale of this 9 years of training data. These are things like topography, soil type, vegetation type, indices related to climate, which probably that's a bad assumption that those don't change, but for the first part of this talk, we're going to hold those constant. And we're giving all those things to the LSTM, and we're having it predict stream flow. So it's a rainfall runoff model trained over 531 basins, 10 years, and using different types of meteorological data. So there's quite a diversity in the catchments that we're using. So these are the 531 catchments. This is just sort of a sample of the diversity along a couple of different data dimensions. These are sort of the climatic data dimensions, but you can imagine there's diversity in the seasonality of precipitation, how often we receive statistically high precipitation for a particular catchment. That means basically, does your rainfall come more in sudden bursts or more in sort of low continuous amounts? What's the fraction of your precipitation falling as snow? Although we don't give it snow data directly, we measure this by comparing precipitation falling on days where it's above or below freezing. We have a range of aridity indices. We have a range of soil types, range of geologies, vegetation, etc. So we're trying to get at least as much diversity as we can in this single experiment, but using only high quality data and sort of constrained to data that other groups have used, so that we can do benchmarking against other models. So like I said, the CAMELS data set is sort of a standard data set in hydrology. It's certainly not the only one people use, but it is one that a lot of groups have used. So what Freddie did when he wrote his first paper on these LSTMs is he went out and asked groups to contribute model runs over these same catchments, and he got a set of 447 of the 531 catchments that a whole bunch of model groups had already calibrated their models to. And he asked people to submit these model runs to his database, which is again open. It's freely available on Kawashi's HydroShare server. You can go download anytime you want. And he compared the LSTMs to these, or he put the LSTMs into this bag of models in this model intercomparison, and these are sort of the results that came out. Again, each of these models were calibrated and set up and calibrated by different groups. So each one by a group that knows how to use that model and has experience using that model, and often by the developers of those models. So the LSTMs are in orange and green. different flavors of the LSTM. You want to be as far to the right as possible. NSE is sort of like an R² scored. We're just going to pretend like it's R² for the purposes of this talk. So you want as many catchments, that's the CDF on the y, cumulative density function on the y-axis. You want as many catchments to have as high R² scores as possible. So you want your CDF curves to be as far to the right as possible. So the LSTMs are in orange and green, and the other models are in other colors, okay? And what we're seeing, we have sort of two benchmarking cases here. And the first benchmarking case we're going to look at is on the right, which is where every model, not the LSTMs, but every conceptual hydrology model is calibrated for each basin individually. So the team went around and calibrated their model for this basin in Florida, this basin in Florida, this basin in Colorado, this basin in New Mexico, separately for each basin. And traditionally in hydrology, this is extremely well known. There's no controversy in what I'm about to say. Traditionally in hydrology, models always do best when calibrated to long data records in individual catchments, right? So you always, if you want the best possible predictions, you're going to get those in a basin with a gauge, a stream gauge that's been around for a long time and where you spend a lot of time really calibrating your model to that one particular catchment. And that's what's been done for all of these non-LSTM models here on the right-hand subplot. They've been calibrated by usually by the model developers or people that use the models regularly to each individual CAMELS basin. Over here on the right, we have a plot where the modelers have used a couple groups, just a couple groups. In fact, Vic and MHM are the only two that did this. They used what's called regionalization strategies. So they tried to figure out a way to take data from all the basins, or at least a bunch of the basins at a single time, and come up with a sort of aerial, spatial parameter sets for these models so that they can apply them. Eventually, they can apply them in different places. Here, they're not applying them in basins that are out of sample. They're applying them, they're just using all of the data available to them to calibrate the models and come up with spatially aware parameter maps. So all of the catchments participated in the calibration process, but it was one calibration process. Not that the models use the same parameters for every basin, but that all the data was used to come up with sort of something like spatial maps or spatial transfer functions of observable catchment attributes onto hydrological model parameters. And then those transfer functions were used to parameterize the model. Okay, so this is called regional modeling in hydrology, and it's sort of a first step to making predictions in basins where you don't have stream gauges. In both cases, the LSTM outperforms, and these LSTMs they're the same LSTMs in both graphs, and they're regionally calibrated. So this is just one LSTM. Each one of these lines is just one LSTM that's been calibrated on all the data and run on all the data. So there was some hyperparameter tuning, but these are not calibrated by individual basin in individual basins. So the regional LSTM is beating the basin calibrated hydrology models. Now we go out of sample, so we're training on K. We're splitting the basins into K-fold validation sets, and we're training on K-1 of those sets, and testing on one set, and then repeating that pattern so that we make out of sample predictions on all the basins. And we do that for the purple line here. The purple line is the prediction in ungauged basins, PUB, LSTM. PUB is sort of one of the named problems in hydrology. Prediction in ungauged basins. It was the decadal problem of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences from 2003 to 2013. It's an unsolved problem in hydrology. It's one of the few named problems in the field. So what we did is we took data from 9/10 of these basins, trained a single LSTM, and used it to predict on the other 10%. We came up with this purple line. So here's the CDF plots we talked about before. This is just a smooth histogram of these same data, the same statistics. It's just another way to look at it. So the purple line is the prediction in ungauged basins. And the orange line is the Sacramento model, which is sort of a standard model in the United States. This Sacramento model was calibrated by INCAR, so not by us, by people that have a lot of experience using the model, and it was calibrated to each individual basin, so not regionalized, actually calibrated separately for each basin. And what you can see is that the purple line is sort of further to the right than the orange line. So the LSTMs are doing better in ungauged basins than the hydrology models. The traditional hydrology models are doing engaged basins. Okay, so this is sort of a breakthrough in hydrology. For the first time, we're kind of getting state-of-the-art quality predictions in basins without stream gauges. In fact, we're able to sort of, I don't know if you want to consider Sacramento model state-of-the-art. It's not the best model in the calibration in the benchmark data set, but it's a good model that's used very often, and we can actually beat it out of sample when it's calibrated in sample. Okay, so how does it work? So, well, we can talk about that in a minute, I guess, but basically what's happening here, the phenomenon that's happening here is that the deep learning models learn from big data. So they do better when they see more data during training. And this includes diverse data. So this is just LSTMs, two sets of LSTMs. The solid line is where we train one LSTM for the whole country and then predict out of sample in time. The dotted line is where we train a separate LSTM for each basin and do really extensive hyperparameter tuning, not just parameter learning, not just backpropagation and weight training, but actually hyperparameter tuning separately for each basin. And we come up with this CDF plot in the dotted line. Whereas if we throw all of the data into one LSTM, we do hyperparameter tuning on that one LSTM. So again, 2 orders of magnitude less computational effort. We get the dark green line, the solid line. And what's interesting here is that sort of this is the first time in history that of hydrology modeling where you get better results by giving the model training data from multiple catchments. And so this seems reasonable. We would think that if you train a model on a lot of data, it has more data to learn about hydrological. It has more opportunity to learn about hydrological processes and hydrological diversity. That's never been the case in the past. You have to tune each model to each basin. But here the model can do something that looks like taking experience that it's had up in Upper Michigan and translating that in some sense, at least some information from that experience down into a catchment in the Appalachians, for example. Okay, so we can kind of look at how the model transfers that information and we get pictures that look like this. So this is sort of a first step toward explainable AI. So what we're doing is we're cutting out a particular gate from the LSTM. We're forcing that gate. It's just one particular gate. It doesn't really matter which one, but what matters, it's actually the gate that controls the state, the input gate. But what it's doing is this is the portion of the gate that's only acting, this is only acting on static catchment attributes. So not the dynamic meteorological forcings, but only the characteristics that we've given the model that distinguishes one catchment from another. Okay, and so there are 531 catchments on the x-axis, and there's 256 cell states in the LSTM. The x vector here is 256 dimensions, and so there's 256 numbers that characterize the input gate as it reacts to static catchment attributes for each basin. So this is the fingerprint that the model has learned for each basin. This is sort of the ID, the way that the model has encoded I'm in this basin versus this other basin. And what you can see is that it kind of learns to group basins. It says this group is similar, this group is similar, this sort of group here at 140 is dissimilar than the group over here at 120. And it kind of learns that these basins are similar to the other, and so I should learn to transfer information between these types of basins. And you can see hard cutoffs here, and these hard cutoffs are due to the fact that the ordering of these basins are based on USGS ID number, and so USGS ID numbers jump, so we may have a certain sort of USGS region here and another USGS region here, but in general, it's able to pick these things out just from the attributes of the catchment. If someone's texting, I can't see it. Okay, so we can kind of see what's controlling these gate structures, or these catchment fingerprints. We can do dimensionality reduction on these 531 basins by 256 dimensions. We can reduce that down to 2 dimensions and plot the 531 basins down in the 2 dimensions. So we've reduced 256 down to 2. These are completely arbitrary dimensions, X and Y. And we can kind of see that the model is clustering the basins in sort of a pretty distinct way. So the model kind of learns that there's 4 really distinct classes of basins in this data set in terms of how the rainfall turns into streamflow. This is clustering based on how the model has learned to partition catchments due to how they react to rainfall. And really what we can see here is that what's controlling these catchments, this is subjective and sort of visual, but what's controlling these catchments is the vegetation. So we have 2 catchments that have high forest fraction, or 2 clusters that have high forest fraction in general, 2 clusters that have low forest fraction, 2 clusters that have the annual GVF difference is the difference between summer and winter or fall and spring vegetation greenness. So the difference in greenness between the high point and the low point of greenness in a particular catchment. So high GVF difference means seasonal vegetation, and low GVF difference means sort of perennial or evergreen vegetation. And we get deciduous forests, we get evergreen forests, and we get seasonal non-forest, and we get non-seasonal non-forest. We can play the same game by letting in a dynamic way. So again, this is the portion of the input gates that's reacting to the inputs that we're giving the model about catchments that don't change in time. So these are the static catchment attributes that distinguish one catchment from another. But maybe the catchment attributes are changing. So for example, maybe the climate is one of those attributes that we're giving it that distinguishes between catchment. That's the total average precipitation, long-term precipitation, the total average temperature, the total average fraction of snow, these sorts of things. And maybe those things change in time. Maybe the catchment, the climate in a particular catchment is evolving. So we can now, instead of giving it static catchment attributes, we can give it dynamic catchment attributes that evolve in time. And we can look at how those gate structures change over time. So how that matrix changes over time. And here we're not going to look just at the input gate. We're going to look at the input gate, the forget gate, and the output gate. So this is 3 times 256 different dimensions plotted down reduced down into 3 dimensions using, in this case, principal component analysis. And we're going to watch how the catchments migrate in this space. So catchments that are close together in this space are reacting to climate similarly, and catchments that are further apart in this space are reacting to climate differently. And what you can see is that as the climate changes in these particular catchments that we've decided to highlight here, the catchments become more similar to each other or less similar to each other. And if we really want to stare at this, we can start to look at, let's say, the catchments in Southern California, which went through major droughts during this period of time. We can start to see how they react to droughts, and then how they end up and become more like catchments in Southern Texas, and then how they become dissimilar from catchments in Southern Texas and become more similar to catchments in, let's say, Eastern Washington, for example, or over here on the East Coast. And you can kind of just at least get a intuitive and qualitative sense that the models are learning to learn how catchments are similar, and how as climate evolves in these catchments, how those that affects the gate structures in the neural networks. Okay, well, that's not what I wanted to push. Okay. So we can do other sorts of things. There's lots of uncertainty in the input data that we're giving to these things. And so the way that hydrologists deal with uncertainty is that they usually give their models ensembles of forcing data, and then they use ensembling techniques like Bayesian model averaging or independent information analysis, independent component analysis, different ways to combine ensembles after you've run them. And so typically what a modeler will do is feed a bunch of different precipitation products into their rainfall-runoff model, and then do something like averaging the outputs of those models. And you don't have to do that with deep learning. That's a really big project, by the way. There's a paper by Martin Clark at NCAR back in 2015 that outlines this sort of production strategy called hydrologic storylines, which is where you have all these degrees of freedom in a modeling chain. So not just in the model, but in the modeling chain, from which precipitation product you pick, how do you parameterize the model, recognizing that no calibration is perfect, how do you downscale the precipitation product, how do you deal with uncertainty in the model structure, and it's a combination. If you were to sample all of these put distributions over all these pieces of uncertainty, and then sample all of these, and then run a model for each one of those samples, it would be a combinatorially large problem. And that's hard to do in practice. That's something that, for example, when I was at NCAR, the group I was with was trying to set up a system that does that, and it's years of model development. With deep learning, the problem becomes much, much easier. So I'm not saying that you can solve the problem with deep learning, but it's much, much easier. So here's an example of that. So you can take multiple precipitation products and feed them into a single deep learning model to predict stream flow, and you can let the model learn how to combine these products. So the plot on the left here shows just that the green lines are single forcing LSTMs. The purple and blue line, the purple line is when we give the LSTM 3 forcing products instead of 1, and the blue lines are where we give it 2 forcing products. So we have 3 available to us, DayMet, Mauer, and NLDAS in the CAMELS dataset, and we can feed in combinations of those. And we can see that just a single LSTM learns to combine these products and give us improvement in streamflow, a pretty large improvement, actually. The improvement is on the order of magnitude of sort of the improvement we got by moving from a conceptual hydrology model to an LSTM. We get sort of that order of magnitude improvement, again, by letting the LSTM have multiple forcing data products. We see that kind of improvement in the conceptual models too. So this isn't necessarily a fact of like the LSTM necessarily outperforming. So we can take the Sacramento model and we can give it 3 different data products, and we can do Bayesian model averaging, or in this case, it worked best just to do straight model averaging to average the outputs and get sort of an ensembling-based product of hydrographs. And we get a similar order of magnitude improvement there, but this here takes a lot more work, right? We have to calibrate the model a bunch of times. We have to figure out how to ensemble the model the best, and in order to get this improvement. And what's happening with, and then this is a linear or pseudo-linear or variance-based, usually ensembling product. What happens in the deep learning model is it learns how to combine the different forcing products in spatially, temporally dynamic ways. So this tries to break that out. The colors are the 3 forcing data products in LDAS, Mauer, and DayMet. It doesn't matter which is which, but they're just orange, green, and blue. And this shows which forcing product in which catchment the model learns to listen to the most in order to make predictions at time t equals 0. And so this is what the forcing products that the model listens to the most at the current time step. 1 time step in the past, 2 time steps in the past, and 3 time steps in the past. And you can kind of see that it kind of learns that there's some sort of temporal advantage to understanding, to listening to one of the data products now, and then really looking in the past to see the last data product. And we're pretty sure that this has to do with actually, to be perfectly honest, with an error in the data product. We're not 100% sure because we don't have access to the algorithms to produce the product, but we did contact the product developers, and it looks like there's a time zone. My guess is there's a time zone error in this orange data product here, which is why it's very valuable in the past. It's maybe a high accuracy product, but it may be not averaged correctly over the right day. That's just a guess, but there's a very clear, we outlined this in the paper down here. But also the model is learning to listen to different products in the rising limb of the hydrograph versus the falling limb of the hydrograph. Like it likes this orange product if it's raining, but it likes the green meteorological product if it's not raining at the current time step, for example. So if we want to do multi-timescale simulation, so like let's say we want to produce seasonal predictions or daily predictions or hourly predictions, which are all useful for different types of use cases in hydrological forecasting, we may want a model that produces multiple times predictions at multiple time scales. So here we're comparing against the U.S. National Water Model, which produces hourly predictions that are averaged up to daily, and these predictions are available on as a reanalysis product on the Amazon Web Service. So we're just using the publicly available data from the National Water Center, and we get the National Water Model daily is this solid orange line, and the National Water Model hourly is this dotted orange line. And this is a really common phenomenon in hydrology where it's sort of easier. You get a little bit of added, everybody that deals with climate data knows this, you get a little bit of added benefit by averaging over some temporal or spatial window. Here we're averaging just over the difference between hours and days, but it does allow a little bit of improvement in accuracy in the National Water Model. Of course, the LSTMs do better, which is not unexpected, but the real interesting thing here is that predicting in hourly and daily timescales, you don't have that loss in information when you move to hourly timescales from daily timescales. And we have a paper about that. Martin Gausch, who's a master's student who just submitted a paper and has it open access on arXiv. You can go and look at the model structure that's being used there. It's something like an encoder decoder LSTM. It's not that. It's pretty interesting, actually. I shouldn't say it's not interesting, but he's put a lot of thought into how to structure the LSTM so that they can do these multi-time step predictions, and the result is a model that doesn't lose information when you move to hourly. Basically, what he's doing is he's training a daily LSTM, and he's taking the hidden state from that and using that hidden state to initialize an hourly LSTM. And the reason that's advantageous is because if you were to just train on hourly data, you would have a huge number of time steps. That RNN, recurrent neural network, or LSTM would be rolled out over a very large number of time steps in order to account for enough memory to be hydrologically relevant. So we're going back, all these models look back 1 year in time, and going back 1 year in hours is about 9,000 time steps. It's only 365 days for daily. So if you roll out an LSTM for 9,000 time steps, first of all, it's very computationally expensive, and second of all, you get memory leaks. So those sigmoid gates that are controlling the memory timescales, they're never going to be exactly one. And so basically, if the model would like that memory channel to be open, it's going to have a value of, like, let's say 0.999 But if you raise 0.999 to the 9,000th power in your back propagation gradient chain, you're going to get zeros. And so there's really no memory that lasts back 9,000 time steps. So we have to use these multi-time step models, and they work pretty well. Okay.
Start wrapping up.
Yeah, cool. So I'll just say one more thing. We're interested in, so we've done a lot of work, and if you read my controversial paper, you'll see we really talked very poorly about the physics-based hydrology models, and I think that's deserved. We've done a lot of work over the years showing that these models are really very bad, and that's true for most hydrology models. But that doesn't mean the hydrology community doesn't know anything about how rainfall turns into stream flow, and so we're kind of interested in understanding whether there's value in bringing physical understanding into these models, right? And so we don't know the answer to that question. So the hydrology community is right at the beginning of physics-informed machine learning or knowledge-guided machine learning. And aside from one study that has some sort of weak evidence and was published just a couple months ago, there's really no studies that show real solid value of bringing physics into deep learning model structures. All the studies published to date, the deep learning models win by a lot over the physically based models in every test that I'm aware of, and there are dozens of them published now. But that doesn't mean there's no value in the physical hydrology. But it's up to the community to find that value. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is looking at physically informed machine learning. This is a paper we submitted to NeurIPS recently. NeurIPS workshop recently, and basically what it is we've tried to work at how at embedding conservation laws into this recurrent neural network structure. So the LSTM is attractive to us because it has an input state output relationship, and we want to keep that x of t is equal to the state at the previous time step plus the influxes across the boundary minus the outfluxes. We'd like to formalize an LSTM to sort of have this structure, and you can do that simply by normalizing the gates. So we can have an input gate that adds to the structure. We can have an output gate that's to the state. We can have an output gate that subtracts from the state. So we have these input and output explicitly. We can rearrange mass, or we can rearrange the contents of the state using some reshuffling matrix. And the key to making sure that all of these pieces obey conservation laws is a particular type of normalization layer. So we have a gate structure. This is a sort of a two-layer neural network. You imagine if this layer was fully connected to this layer, this would just be a two fully connected layer, deep ANN, right? And what we can do is we can normalize all the outputs of these. So if these are bounded, if the activation functions are bounded on the first layer, we can take some sort of norm. Here I've notated an L1 norm, but it could be any type of bounded norm. And we can multiply that norm by the conserved quantity so that now each of the pieces of information coming out of the one layer of the neural network is now a value that is scaled such that if you add them all up, they sum up to a known quantity C. So let's say C is precipitation. It's in units of millimeters or some mass units of water coming in. And we want part of the neural network to simulate fluxes of mass instead of information transfers. We can just take a section of our gate structure, normalize that section, and multiply it by the conserved quantity. So now, if you do this at every layer, then this conservation propagates through the network, and you can never get portions of the network. First of all, every portion of the network that's involved in this sort of particular type of scaled normalization has units, physical units associated with it, and you can never get total. If you arrange these layers and normalizations correctly, you can arrange them in such a way that you never get more or less mass in the system than you've put in through your boundary conditions. And so these sigmoids are those normalization gates, the normalized gates rather than the standard LSTM gates. And all it takes is really multiplying the input state information transfers by these normalized gates rather than the regular gates in the LSTM. And you can kind of show, again, we have a theorem that shows this that was not done by me, done by some people at Johannes Kepler University, that shows that if you structure the LSTM in this way, basically by replacing the standard forget input and output gates by these normalized gates, doing a little bit of rearrangement to the structure, you get an LSTM that actually does obey conservation laws in this sort of explicit sense. And we can apply that to the same experiments that we've been showing. I'm almost done here, and it doesn't add a lot of value. So this KGE is sort of like an R squared. It's used in hydrology, a little different than the NSE, but a common metric. And we get a very, very tiny, statistically significant, but very tiny improvement by using the mass conserving LSTM versus the regular LSTM. But what we'll really get improvement in are the low flow metrics on high flows and low flows. FHV are high flows and FLV are low flows, and we improve biases in the high flows and low flows. And that's because in the mass conserving network, when you put water into the system, that water has to go somewhere. So even if it's never seen a flood peak like that high, this particular extreme before, it still has this much water in it and has to do something with it so it comes out. And so that improves the LSTM already had the best high flow predictions of any of the, peak flow predictions of any of the models that contributed to the benchmarking exercise, but the mass conserving sort of significantly improved on that. Also improved a little bit on the low flows as well. And the last thing I'll say, this is my last slide, is that because all of the states in the LSTM are now labeled with units, so now with the mass conserving LSTM, you can look inside of the network, and every state and every flux has physical units associated with it. Okay, and so you can start to sum up those subsets of those states and see see if they correlate to known stores of water in the watershed. So here's an example of that, where we took 4 of the 64 cell states of the mass conserving LSTM, summed them together, and compared it to a modeled snow product in the catchment. Again, this LSTM had never seen snow data, just precipitation, temperature, and stream flow data. And it learned to partition the precipitation it was given into these 64 cell states that all had physical units. The units are millimeters here of water, which is a mass unit. And you can see that it chose 4 of these states to store snow effectively, and it didn't know it was storing snow. But when we compared it against snow product, the correlation was something like 0.9 or 0.8 to 0.9 across all the catchments. So it's really, this is our first hint that it's sort of learning to represent what's actually happening in the catchment. Okay, that's all I got to say. I just want to thank everybody. I especially want to thank Freddie, who really led all this work, and I'd really also like to thank Alden Sampson, who is the CTO at Upstream Tech and has done a lot of work sort of operationalizing these products, and I highly recommend getting in touch with him if you're interested in knowing what this kind of deep learning work in hydrological forecasting looks like in practice. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Gray. Reminder, if you have a question for him, please use the raise your hand button, or you can type it in the chat box. So I think we'll take the next 10 minutes for questions.
I do want to say one thing, just so I don't get myself in trouble. I'm not actually the director of research at Upstream Tech. I think that was an old, probably someone found something old on the internet. I just want to make sure that's very clear that I don't actually work. I work with Alden. We publish papers together, but I don't work for Upstream Tech.
Okay. So any questions for Gray? All right, question from Steve Sane. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Greg. Fantastic talk. Great stuff in here. You made some comments about incorporating ensembles into the LSTM framework, and maybe I sort of did understand what you said. But I would think that that's not a trivial thing to do, and it would depend a lot on how the ensembles were actually created.
Yeah.
Can you kind of comment on that again?
Yeah, so in this case, in this particular experiment, what I'm calling an ensemble is just 3 different precipitation products by 3 different groups. So not like a GFS ensemble, the true GFS ensemble, although I don't see why the situation would be different in that case. So the reason why this works is because you're going to have redundancy in any ensemble product that you use as forcing data, or in any model output. You're going to have redundancy, and that's the hard problem. If you were just straight average your ensemble members, either pre-processing or post-processing, you're going to introduce bias based on bias in the ensemble, right? And what the nonlinear model structure can do in the LSTM is sort of learn to pick out that bias, because it's anchored on the other end by having to match stream flow. It can kind of learn, well, if I give it a whole bunch of data that is redundant, it can kind of learn, well, I'll listen to this data product and not this data product. And of course you have problems of overfitting, but with really, really large data sets, you would hope that the idea is that it would learn the redundancy in the ensembles. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. I guess that would be the hope, right? Do you have any I don't know, is there any evidence by looking at the network or any other way that it's actually doing that?
Yeah, well, it's just that it works.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know how else to test it. If you read this paper, you will see everything we've come up with in terms of understanding how it's combining the model. So it's a really hard problem to sort of understand how the model's combining the precipitation products, because it's impossible to know the uncertainty in the precipitation products going in, right? And
Right.
so what we did is we looked at how much the three different products agreed with each other or disagreed with each other, and then we correlated that, and you can find correlations between that and which product the model chooses to prefer. So that's all stuff we've looked at. But what you can't do is you can't say whether that agreement is real or fake, because there's no like truth, right? There's no true precipitation to compare these things to, right? I mean, even if you have gauges. So I think the strongest test, and I really couldn't imagine a way to improve on this without fundamentally sort of increasing the physical sensor network, like without actually just having better data, is just that it works. And so, yeah, that's really all I have. If you have an idea about how better to test that, I will say we spent a huge amount of time on that question, and really, the limiting factors are the limiting factor is that we don't have true precipitation, so we don't know whether redundancy in the precipitation data is due to the fact that they both agree with truth or that they both have similar biases. And we do see strong diversity in how the model learns to pay attention to different products in different places and different hydrological conditions. So we know it's doing something nonlinear, and we know that it works. It gives slightly better results than traditional ensembling techniques. Yeah.
Okay,
Great. Thank you.
Yep. I have another question that raised their hand, and then we'll jump down to a chat box for questions. So Andre Erler, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hello. That was a really very interesting talk. You mentioned that you're operationalizing this, and so I'm assuming you're using weather forecasts for the forcing, but how are you getting the initial state? Are you using some kind of data assimilation, or?
Look back, just long records. And in fact, in our research grade models, I don't want to talk about the exact numbers in the operational models, but in the research grade models, we use 1 year of look back. So we do sequence to one prediction, which is important for several reasons. And then so we run a whole model looking back 1 year to predict every individual data point. And just so you know, the reason that we do that is because it gives diversity in the mini batches. So it's a little bit more computationally expensive, but the trade-off in terms of the learning speed, like the number of epochs you need to sort of asymptote the training curves, is much, much less. So it's actually more efficient to do it like that. And so that's how we get the initial conditions. We initialize at zeros or some random number, and then we just run for long enough that we hope that that basically spin up. We basically use spin up.
Okay.
Yeah, and so you could do better than that. Okay, so it's absolutely possible to do better than that, and you could train the initial states, which we found doesn't help. That's easy enough to do. You could use a longer look back, and the problem there is that you have the LSTM can't handle missing data, and so you're sort of, the longer the sequences you use, the more data you have to throw away. And we found in this particular CAMELS data set, the answer will depend on the data set you're using, but in this particular CAMELS data set, this 1 year look back is sort of, with sequence to one prediction, is sort of the best that we've been able to do.
Mm. So you haven't used like data integration, or like Chopin, Chen, I think it's used that.
Yeah, you can't use that in ungauged basins. So no.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. There are ways to do data assimilation. One way is to feed in lag streamflow data, which is, to be perfectly honest, avoiding lag streamflow data was sort of why we got into deep learning in the first place. And so there are better ways to use lag streamflow data. So one way to do that is you can use it in a data assimilation context. So data assimilation becomes a little bit easier in deep learning. You can actually take the difference in a forward, not in a training setting, but in a prediction setting. You can take the difference between your observation and your prediction, and you can, because you have the backpropagation gradient chain already set up for the network, you have the gradient chain already set up for the network, even in prediction mode, you can propagate that back up through to adjust anything in the model you want. You could adjust the model states or the model inputs. Alden adjusts, well, he adjusts model inputs. He's found that's the best. And that's how he, in the places where he's making predictions that actually do have gauges, he can assimilate that gauge data that way. And that also, the result of that is that his model also works in areas where he doesn't have gauge data. And that's sort of the best way we found to use gauge data in the forward prediction.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
In the chat boxes, we have a couple questions. One from Eric DeWeaver. He asks, have you used your methods to figure out what we should be observing? In other words, what kind of observations give you the most bang for buck?
Yeah, that's a super good question. In fact, Keith Bevan published an article, response to our article, and asked that question. And no, the answer is no. So if anyone can, okay, so I'm sorry, I think I may jump the gun there. All of these papers, I think every single one of these papers, probably with the exception of one, has a sensitivity analysis in it. So every time we publish a paper, we do a sensitivity analysis to understand which inputs are causing the most effect in the model. And we try to present those sensitivity analysis in ways that are specifically relevant to whatever we're doing in that particular paper. So like in the paper, this paper, where we're looking at how it learns catchment grouping, we're specifically interested in the sensitivity to the individual catchment properties like geology and soil and vegetation. And the way, the strategy that we've sort of consistently used through all these papers to do sensitivity analysis is integrated gradients. It's a relatively cheap and easy method that kind of gives interpretable results. And there are other ways to do it, but that one's kind of fine. So if the answer is, do we know which, in fact, I think I have those slides down here in my extra slide, maybe. I cut those slides out because they're not my favorite. I don't have them. I'm sorry, I don't have them. But yeah, you can go to our paper and you can look at which inputs are the model learns to listen to the most. And in general, it's the ones that you would expect. It's like, I think the #1 catchment attribute is the climatic index related to precipitation. And I think #2 is the area of the catchment. Okay, so instead, the question that I actually wanted to respond to at first, which may have been what you were asking, is, do we know what kind of data we could bring in that we don't already have that would improve the model? And the answer to that is no. And as soon as someone figures out how to do that, please, let me know.
Okay, and let's finish this off with 2 questions from email. The first one is, what is the best paper to read up on the XAI, explainable AI work that you presented?
Yeah, there's a couple actually. Since we're on the slide, here's one. So this is Freddie's paper that I wasn't involved in at all, where he looks at snow states in the LSTM, not the mass conserving LSTM, but just snow states in the regular LSTM. And this is just an absolutely fascinating paper. This is it was published somewhere, I don't remember, a book chapter, but it's also on archive. So it's called Neural Hydrology, Interpreting LSTMs in Hydrology. I absolutely love this paper, and I was not involved with it. But I think that the main explainability paper that we have so far is this one, which is towards learning universal, regional, and local hydrological behaviors. And that's published in Hydrology and Earth System Science last year. And it's the one where we start to look at the gate structures of the LSTMs. So I'll post this on, you'll have access to the slides. I hope this roadmap is useful. This paper where we had the dynamic gate structures, where we actually looked at how the gates reacted to changing climate. This was published in a conference proceeding this is the wrong citation. No, it's the right citation. Yeah. A conference proceeding in the NOAA Climate Diagnostics and Prediction Workshop from last year, which you can find on Google Scholar. And this is a really short paper that looks at what happens if we take these sorts of ideas about looking at the gate structures of the LSTM and then make those gate structures dynamic rather than static. That's in terms of our papers, that's what I would recommend. If you want an answer about explainable AI in general, email me and I'll send you a textbook that our reading group at Google is using that I really like a lot. I'd be happy to share that. I don't remember the name off the top of my head.
Right, and her final question is: integrated gradients your preferred method? If so, why?
Okay, so to be perfectly honest, I don't know. So certainly integrated gradients are easy to implement, they're easy to understand, they make sense, and they sort of address the sort of obvious problems with gradient-based sensitivity analysis of neural networks, okay? Which is, just so you know, the reason you don't want to just take gradients of neural networks is because, and use those as sensitivity measures, is because the activation functions become saturated in the extremes. They're only, so if you're taking the gradient around a particular data point, that where a particular input might be super sensitive, like that, the activation function might be activated heavily depending on the value of that input, you may not know that if you're out on the tail of an activation function at a particular data point. And so it could be the case that pure gradient analyses give you misleading sensitivity metrics. And so that's the problem that integrated gradients are supposed to solve. And that seems very nice to me. And the other thing that I like about integrated gradients is that you don't have to develop any surrogate models or make any assumptions about how you're going to sample or diversity in your sample, or you don't have to make any assumptions. You just run the model at the data points you have, and you kind of get an estimate. Now, it's an average over local. It's a local sensitivity analysis. All the metrics you get. The only way to go to global sensitivity analysis is to sort of average your locals and look at distributions of your locals, and that's a downside. But I'm going to be honest with you. We use it because we're lazy, and it's just really easy to do.
Yeah, it's integrated in many tools, isn't it?
I don't know. We wrote our own code to do it.
Oh, did you? Okay. Yeah, it's still a local gradient. That's why I'm still not a total fan of it, because it doesn't take the global things into account. But anyway, we can have a longer discussion some other time about that.
Yeah. So I'll be honest with you. I'm suspicious of it. I'm not sure that it's the right way to go, because just to give you a sense, this analysis from our 2019 paper about static catchment attributes, if you do dimensionality reduction on the feature layer on the input gates, and you sort of visually correlate those with what features are important, the ones that pop out are vegetation. That's a subjective analysis, but it's meaningful in a sense. I think it's meaningful in a sense. If you do the integrated gradients on these same features, the vegetation, the forest fraction, and the GVF, which appear to be highly correlated with clustering in this feature layer, just visually, are way down on the list of sensitive parameters. Okay, so that may be okay, that may be right. This is a totally subjective analysis here, but it makes me suspicious.
All right, thank you, Gray. So I think at this point, we will conclude the open session of today's webinar. A recording of this talk will be shared later this week. Coming up in 2 weeks on November 9th, we will have Brian Kaiser, a postdoc at Los Alamos National Laboratory, who has a physical oceanography background. So until then, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about US CLIVAR or the working group. And thank you everyone for participating.